a unique, world-class aircraft. It is not that it was something I couldn't dream of, honestly. I didn't even dare think of it. This aircraft is something that you just love. Ruslan is the crown of great work done by the team led by Oleg Antonov. An admirable look. The story of the An-124 began in 1965 at Le Bourget International Air Show in Paris. The Russian An-22 Antares aircraft created a real sensation at the show, as the first wide-body aircraft in the world able to carry up to 80 tons of cargo.
In just a few days, the An-22 had left a lasting impression on the Western aviation world.
Just after the Le Bourget Air Show, a tender was announced in the USA to design and construct an aircraft that would exceed the capability and performance of the Soviet plane. And the aviation race for heavyweight air superiority had started. After 2 years, at the air parade at Moscow's Domodedovo Airport, the world would see that it was actually not a race, but a commercial war. It was the first air parade observed by Leonid Brezhnev as the head of the Soviet state. Having displaced Nikita Khrushchev for the post of First Secretary of the USSR Communist Party in 1964, by the July of 1967, Brezhnev found himself in a rather difficult situation. In January, the Soviet automatic exploration spacecraft Luna 12 had crashed into the surface of the moon. In April, a military coup in previously friendly Greece saw the so-called Black Colonels regime take power. And in the same month, Vladimir Komarov, Yuri Gagarin's friend, died in an accident in the landing module of the new Soyuz 1 spacecraft. In June, the six-day war in the Middle East ended with a crushing defeat of Arab troops armed with Soviet aeroplanes, tanks, and guns. Next, China tests its first H-bomb. All of these events had serious implications for the Soviet Union's plans to expand its influence in the world. Moreover, 1967 was the year of the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution. It was totally unacceptable to celebrate the Jubilee with such a long trail of recent problems. The USSR had to respond with a serious move to demonstrate the power of the Soviets that was suitably impressive to gain the world's attention. The event that was decided upon at a closed meeting of the Central Committee of the Communist Party was to be more than just an air display. It was conceived as a localized, large-scale military operation within a limited theater. It was shocking. Photographs showing defense attachés with their mouths wide open, watching self-propelled tactical missile launchers crawl out from Antiosis, hit news bulletins all over the world the very next day. The Daily Telegraph in the United Kingdom recorded the event under the headline of Parade at Domodedovo, Colossal Success of Russian Aviation. It was a statement echoed around the world. On the same day, France Press declared Western defense attachés staggered by superiority of the Soviets in a number of areas. In America, reports were confused. Aviation Week commented, the Soviet aerospace industry and its military customers increasingly invest in development of new aircraft and tactics that can be applied in conditions of modern, localized non-nuclear warfare. Nearly all new aircraft displayed at Domodedovo are designed for this purpose. A special US Congress meeting was held after the parade, and just a week later, the Pentagon requested Lockheed, that had won the contract tender to design and deliver a heavy freighter to the US Air Force, to urgently put into operation the C-5 Galaxy prototype, and allocated additional funding for that purpose.
Был построен опытная партия C-5.
The test batch of several C-5s was finished and flight testing started. The new freighter was prepared for production at the same time.
И оказалось, я не буду сейчас детально говорить.
But, as it turned out, the aircraft was only marginally better than the An-225 and didn't have the impact that was originally called for.
Чуть-чуть. У них было много просчетов, много неудачных технических решений, и самолет получился, откровенно говоря, так себе.
And at that time, we were already thinking about a machine that should be better than Galaxy, able to tackle a wider range of tasks than your new American freighter.
The display at Domodedovo was a perfect provocation. It made the US government redistribute financial flows and take rash spending decisions. Actually, the whole US economy seemed to serve Lockheed, spending the money that otherwise could be used to expand the US's global presence. Thus, the USSR gained a huge time allowance benefit, along with an opportunity to learn from others' mistakes, in creating its own strategic heavy-lift cargo aircraft. The designers did not rush. Antius had been flying for 3 years by then and fulfilled every task it was supposed to. Project 400, the provisional name of the aircraft that later would be called Ruslan, had its own way of development based on precision, originality, and taking into account mistakes made in the development of other aircraft. By 1973, after 6 years of design work, the appearance of the new machine was completed, along with a new economic model for the USSR aircraft production industry. The aircraft that would later become the An-124 Ruslan was the result of high-precision work by research institutes and design bureau. New plants and townships were built to support the new project, with modern machine tools and manufacturing equipment, electronics, alloys, and other materials being developed. It was a nationwide effort. 1975, Vietnam. On the outskirts of Saigon, it was one of the most notorious crashes of the C-5 aircraft. The war that was another clash of US and USSR interests comes to an end. Operation Baby Lift saw babies and children flown out by military and private planes from the besieged capital of South Vietnam. There were 328 people on board the Galaxy that crashed shortly after takeoff due to sudden separation of the lower rear fuselage, and 172 of them died. Within minutes, people dressed in peasant clothes could be seen at the crash site. They were picking up and taking with them what remained from the aircraft: pieces of fuselage lining, documents, and parts. In just 2 days, the materials retrieved from the C-5 crash site were received in Moscow. After 2 more days, these important materials were delivered to Kiev in a top-secret file and passed to the Antonov Design Bureau. They were marked for detailed study and consideration of possible use. This was routine intelligence work at that time, as both sides tried to collect as much information about each other as possible. The USSR military needed Antonov's heavy-lift freighter because they had very specific plans for it. For Antonov himself, the information passed by the intelligence agency to the Design Bureau was redundant. The photographs were just added to the latest volume of documentation and deposited in the archives.
Yes, there really was an aircraft that we looked at, and it was the C-5 Galaxy. But it had 2 shaft engines, and our design had 3 shafts. The 3-shaft design is an innovation in aircraft engineering.
It was a revolution in aircraft propulsion engineering. 4 such engines could lift 400 tons. This weight was used by Oleg Antonov as reference for his new aircraft design. In the short list of truly talented aircraft designers, the name of Oleg Antonov holds a special and respected place. It was his design bureau that developed the design system upon which heavy transport aeroplanes are designed and built in the world today. Before the age of computer-aided design, there was already a section in his design bureau that managed to analyze all aircraft designs then available from all over the world and derive laws and regularities that made it possible to tell, after looking at drawings and layouts, whether any given aircraft would fly or forever stay on the ground. Moreover, to tell how it would fly, what it would be able to carry, whether it would be efficient or turn out to be a liability to its operator.
The very first thing and the most important thing is the wing. So it is where our focus was. We reviewed about 1,000 wing design options, and of these, 46 were tunnel tested.
That was the first production logistics chain in the USSR. It was impossible to install a press for forming whole wings that are 73 meters long in a single factory. But that was the size of wing required for the Ruslan. It was impossible to set up dedicated production of composite materials that individual components of the fuselage were to be made from. On top of all this, Antonov had forbidden to overstock the production plan because there was just no storage area large enough to accommodate components for such a huge machine. Components were delivered at final assembly just in time and in the exact numbers required.
I remember people from Boeing saying while the Ruslan was being created that this pile of metal will never fly. That's what they said. We bet it will never fly having such a big wing, they said. We will owe you a railway car. No, a whole train full of beer if it flies. But we're sure it won't. They lost their bet as it finally turned out. As we progressed with the project, we saw how far-sighted Oleg Antonov and his design team were, because it was a whole philosophy that they had created. Aerodynamics, stresses, durability, resources, and structure as an integrated set. It was the merger of this unique theoretical framework, practices, and expertise that ensured the unique capabilities of the aircraft.
207 inventions that received USSR certificates of recognition. 4,000 new elements, parts, instruments, and units. Lines of the best technology then available in the country and, perhaps in the whole world, converged for the Ruslan project. A burst of know-how, as delighted Western reporters would write after watching Ruslan for the first time at the Le Bourget Air Show in 1985. The great standoff of the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and United States, reached its peak by the mid-1980s. With the war in Afghanistan continuing and a South Korean Boeing being shot down over Sakhalin, the USSR was now called the Evil Empire in the West. The US SDI plans, Strategic Defense Initiative, or as journalists called it, the Star Wars program, have been publicly announced. The American space shuttle was already in operation, and the USSR was developing its Buran as a response. In December 1984, in the run-up to the Le Bourget Air Show, the Americans were willing to demonstrate the power of the C-5 Galaxy. December the 17th, Edwards Air Force Base. Ruslan's closest competitor is being prepared for setting a world record in load carrying capacity. First, the US national record in terms of maximum takeoff weight. Then the Galaxy should lift 111 tons of payload. Altitude 2,000 meters, record set. To specialists, that meant the Americans were going all out in order to be able to take a nuclear missile anywhere in the world on board the aircraft. The USSR accepted the challenge and announced a moratorium on the deployment of its missiles in Europe on the 7th of April 1985, and offering a meeting between the heads of state. The USA rejects the offer. And then Soviet leaders take an extraordinary decision. All military equipment was stripped from Ruslan, and the aircraft was presented at the world's major air show. The An-124 was the main feature at Le Bourget in Paris. Good work, an exceptionally straightforward aeroplane, a comment from an article in Flight International, the world's #1 aviation magazine, on the aircraft's public debut.
Пришел к нам на борт главный конструктор Си-5.
Robert Ormsby, chief designer of the C-5, paid us a visit on board. And I remember his name well ever since then. He looked at my badge and said, "At last we meet in person, Victor." Of course, we had met before, but I knew his name well, and he knew my name too. I guess you know why.
Мою фамилию знал, а выводы делайте сами.
Soon after the show, everybody would understand what the exceptionally straightforward Ruslan was up to. July of 1985 in the town of Zhukovsky near Moscow, test airfield of the Gromov Flight Research Institute. Now it is time for the An-124 to be prepared for a world record. But this time, the load is much heavier. 170 tons instead of 111. That's 171,219 kilograms to be exact. Takeoff run, liftoff, climb to 1,000 meters, 2,000, 5, 10, 10,750. And then, after the first undisputed world airlift record, 21 more records followed in a row. "171 tons means more tanks than the C-5 can take, more paratroopers, more infantry, and more missiles. But more importantly, the Ruslan could easily accommodate an intercontinental ballistic missile, SS-19, named by NATO as Stiletto, that had 6 split warheads and countermeasures letting it pass through anti-missile defense systems. Another factor the Americans were well aware of was that the new Antonov An-225 was already waiting for its turn at final assembly at the Kiev plant. 1.5 Ruslans, as they called it at the Design Bureau, and the flying launch pad for the Russian space shuttle and airlift vehicle for future spacecraft. US President Ronald Reagan and USSR General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev met on the 19th of November. It was decided at the meeting to make the next year, 1986, the year of peace. In 1989, the USSR engaged in a disarmament campaign. Missiles and military equipment, originally meant to be carried by Ruslan aircraft, fell under this initiative. Arms were scrapped. Defense budget allocations were cut. As a result, the Ruslan was no longer needed. Aircraft are a truly powerful weapon. But also, as Antonov used to say, it is a means of influence. If your aircraft is the only way to render help to people suffering from a disaster, the effect will be immense. First of all, the aeroplane is a means of transport. It is up to those who control it to decide how to use it.
Since the very beginning of the project, Oleg Antonov had proposed to use this aircraft for civil aviation as well as for military operations.
The very first offer to employ the Ruslan for civil purposes was totally unexpected. there was a requirement to deliver heavy equipment to a major international trade show. Having seen once how easily the Antonov could accommodate cargoes that were not normally transported by air, organizers and partners of the trade show offered the aircraft a job: to deliver their helicopters on board the giant Russian freighter. But the military Ruslan was not authorized for use in such an airlift. It was at this time that Oleg Antonov's vision of Ruslan leaving the military ranks and becoming a civil aircraft was revived.
At that time, we decided, on one hand, to refurbish the aircraft and make it fit for civil operations, and on the other, to change the whole philosophy behind it. So we spent a lot of time on testing and qualification of our giant again, but now as a civil freighter. I used to lead the certification program for the An-124 100 version that now flies all over the world.
But by the time the concept was finally given specific proposals and detailed drawings, the future of the An-124 military heavy lifter had already been determined in another way.
Uncertainty about the Ruslan's destiny was resolved by the leadership of the Soviet Empire in 1989, when it became clear that the empire was no longer able to support the operation of an aircraft of this kind. The government made a decision to stop operation and production of these aircraft for military purposes. However, there were different ways to implement that decision. I was contacted by a group of An-124 enthusiasts who were willing to save the aircraft and give it a second civilian life. And they invited me to join them. I was excited by such an opportunity and agreed.
The name of the new era in the Ruslan's history was the Volga-Dnieper Company. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the military no longer needed Ruslan. It was too busy with its own problems. The state no longer needed Ruslan either, as the same applied to the former republics of the Great Soviet Union that turned away from each other shortly after the empire fell. First, the Baltic republics spun off. Then Georgia, Russia, Moldova, Ukraine, Belarus, and Tajikistan followed. The Soviet Union was collapsing uncontrollably. In 1991, 1/6 of the Earth's surface, previously called the USSR, became history.
The fall of the empire was not only about losing territory and research centers, but most importantly, we lost a common information field. We found ourselves in a chaotic situation.
The rapidly changing economic situation created urgency. The first of the Ruslan heavy lifters waited on the factory production line and was still uncompleted.
We had to start the business from scratch. When we started operating flights, goals and attitudes were quite different then, but the crash of one of our An-12 in 1992 near Skopje, Macedonia, during approach in heavy thunderstorm conditions, provided a distressing but important lesson. The tragedy occurred when we were only starting up our business, but we learned our lesson well. It made us realize that safety should never be compromised, and that is where we started developing our comprehensive flight safety management system.
Engine on fire. Thank you very much. Clear for
Анtonov штурман удаление 3 150, скорость 290.
посадка разрешена.
380.
Молодец.
Удаление 33 задачи.
Сделал с посадкой.
15, 12, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3,
These simulators were installed at the Flight Training Center when the first Ruslan joined the company's fleet. These simulators were not just for pilots to practice emergency operating procedures. Having reviewed all the facts relating to the operation of the giant aircraft, experts at Volga-Dnieper's Analytical Center, much like the Antonov Design Bureau's development center had done several decades ago, loaded the simulators with electronic charts of airfields all over the world, at which the Ruslan was expected to be able to land. So, before being sent on an actual aircraft with actual cargo to a new and unfamiliar airfield, the crew could complete several virtual practice flights. Now, such classrooms have become a routine part of all airline operations. But this is where it all started here. The same for the English language school for pilots and an international business school for aviation managers. Today, this facility trains everyone who is really determined to work in civil aviation.
Это был не просто военный транспорт.
What really matters is that the Ruslan is now more than just a military cargo lifter after its civilian service potential has been explored, developed, and proven.
Практически до Руслана не существовало.
Today, the Ruslan is in high demand all over the world. At peak times, there is a waiting list of those who want to use its services. The aircraft and the team supporting it have proven its right to exist and secured its position in the global air cargo market.
We traveled to the USA to talk to their authorities, who at first were unwilling to let us operate within the US, claiming that our aircraft were not safe enough. Later, we presented to them all the necessary documents providing the necessary evidence that the airplanes conform to international flight safety standards. It was hard to convince them, as they were also afraid of competition in their domestic market. Today, our aircraft and Volga-Dnieper's aircraft operate within the U.S., carrying cargoes between the west and the east coast. Now, this is a regular thing. We were in a very difficult financial situation at that time, as we had problems with revenue and extremely high cost. Just remember how high inflation rate was. While we were desperately thinking about how to reduce costs, our personnel and our first flight crews agreed to receive only half of their pay, with the second half to be paid later when our financial situation improved. I was really impressed as I realized what it meant. First, people trusted us managers. Second, people had trust in our company. And third, well, just imagine the magnitude of this responsibility. After I knew these people could always be relied upon.
The new commercial life of the Ruslan presented plenty of challenges. There was a lot to learn: language, cultural differences, ways to communicate, and so on. There was even a need to learn how to acknowledge the numerous compliments the Ruslan and its crew were receiving in many countries. In 1990, at Le Bourget, when the Ruslan made its debut in the international air cargo market, an English company offered Volga-Dnieper the opportunity of doing business together. Subsequent discussions resulted in the establishment of a joint venture between Heavy Lift Cargo Airlines and Volga-Dnieper. In 1992, The Ruslan contributed $31 million to the Russian economy, according to Forbes. In 1999, it earned its first $100 million in a single year. This money was used for the construction of another aeroplane of the same type. However, in the following year, the joint venture was to end. Russia is ranked third in the world in terms of cargo traffic. Russia is in first place by traffic of oversized and heavy cargoes. The Ruslan aeroplane can take on board 58 hippos, wrote one of the world's leading aviation magazines, several years later in an article about the airlift of animals from a Kenyan zoo. Giraffes and whales, motor vehicles and satellites, turbines for hydroelectric plants, and sophisticated radar stations for search and detection of pirate ships near the shores of Somalia, helicopters, light aeroplanes, and wings for the new Boeing 787 Dreamliner.
I remember we had a series of flights from Australia. Every time we took on a load there, it was a real show for the locals. Lots of people gathered around just to see the aircraft kneel and raise its nose again after loading. I had a feeling that the whole region was coming to watch our aircraft take on cargo.
Money generated by the Ruslan was spent wisely. In the year 2000, a new upgraded aircraft left the workshop at the Ulyanovsk production plant. This was the An-124 version that would later be recognized all over the world. Designed for 50,000 hours of flying, the aircraft was capable of transporting a payload of 120 tons. In 2004, 2 more new Ruslans joined the fleet. One of the pilots said, "We have the stamps of 120 countries on our passports." Now, everybody was talking about this great aeroplane. For Russia, it was a matter of national pride.
Once I had to arrange a very big transaction to finance the purchase of aircraft for a company, and it took our financier 2 years to get an insight into our business due to its very specific nature and complexity. The deal was successfully concluded, and when everything was finalized, one of the bankers told me in private, "You know, Sergei, we've been studying your business very closely for 2 years, but frankly, we are still not sure we know it well. Now we know you and your team, and actually, it is you and your team who we consider to be our best security."
Domodedovo Airport, 2004, the 24th of May. Moscow provided a jubilant welcome for this aircraft, the Boeing 747, and the first Boeing aircraft to be formally delivered to a Russian cargo airline, ABC Airbridge Cargo, that was built upon the experience of operations using Ruslan cargo aircraft and developed into a brand new business. ABC, the first 3 letters of the Latin alphabet. For Boeing, it was indeed a new twist in relations with Russia. As experts would say later, with the appearance of the Russian Boeing, the global aviation community had finally accepted and appreciated Ruslan. This brought to Russia a new discipline and business culture. A new era in Ruslan's evolution had started. Ruslan met its might-have-been rival at an airfield near Moscow. In 1965, the US government requested 3 companies, Boeing, Lockheed, and McDonnell Douglas, to present their proposals for the development of a new perspective heavy lifter. Only Lockheed was able to make something comparable to the Soviet Antonov freighter. It was the C-5. It was Ruslan's rival in heavy lift competition. At that time, Boeing did not succeed in designing a new freighter, but they nonetheless created the best passenger aeroplane in the world. Today, Antonov, Ilyushin, and Boeing work together as one team. And this is now normal business practice. We can transport everything. Today, this slogan, that was the motto of Volga-Dnieper's founder, is a matter of fact. And not only everything, but also to anywhere. Cargo supermarket. That is how Volga-Dnieper's services are characterized in the world today. The aeroplane really bears the signatures of its originators. The experience accumulated by the Perspective Developments team, once established at the Antonov Design Bureau, whose effort resulted in precise specifications for the creation of the largest cargo aircraft in the world, is now being projected to new companies. Antonov was right. Those he taught learned his lessons well and continue his tradition, the tradition of Ruslan.
Has been absolutely.
Yes, the company really has a great future. Air bridge cargo is growing fast with its modern Boeing 747 fleet. It is a company of a new generation. What we really need now is upgraded engines for the An-124. This is extremely important. This aircraft is the best. In Germany, the market presence of an aircraft such as the An-124 is very important. I would say that a company operating An-24s and Boeing 747s at the same time is seen as having great value, and Germany is highly interested in having such a company in its market.
The Ruslan laid the foundation of Volga-Dnieper and now leads a whole network connecting offices and people all over the world. It includes the Hong Kong office and Airbridge Cargo's maintenance experts that serve Russian Boeings. It already includes Amsterdam. This is Ruslan at its home base at Ulyanovsk. And this is the Baikonur space launch site in Kazakhstan, from where the Ruslan carries satellites to the USA. Lockheed modified its shipping tools to fit the cargo into the Antonov An-124 hold. These satellites cannot be accommodated inside the Galaxy aircraft due to their dimensions. This is Frankfurt, Maine. And this is the joint Russian and Ukrainian maintenance base at Leipzig that serves the Ruslan aircraft. There are similar sites in the United Arab Emirates and in Ireland. Today, Ruslan is really bridging the world.
Why is it beneficial to develop maintenance and repair facilities overseas? Specifically because availability of such bases enables Russian manufacturers to export to other countries new equipment produced in Russia. For example, the Tupolev Tu-204 aircraft and so on. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the main problem that all operators of Russia-built aircraft faced was the lack of bases, stocks of spares, and servicing for their equipment. That resulted in a considerable number of such aircraft being either scrapped or sold, or just grounded due to damage. Therefore, I believe that maintenance bases like this, particularly ones in Europe, would make it possible, after the Russian aircraft production industry hopefully revives, for Russia to regain its position in the long term in this area as well.
Today, Russian aircraft are not as popular as before. In the late 1950s, a good half of the world operated flights using Soviet aircraft, or under the Soviet flag, but times have changed. Many good things were lost during the period of transition to modern Russia. And first of all, the tradition. The tradition would be lost completely if not for those who have been able to retain the heritage left by ingenious aviators of the glorious past. All major aircraft corporations in the world are interested in producing Ruslan and Sukhoi aircraft. Everybody would like to purchase licenses and produce these aircraft in any number. That is exactly why the benefits of Ruslan and its future are discussed today at presidential level.
Am I correct in saying that there are great market prospects and many new aircraft are required? The last 2 decades have shown that demand for this aircraft is so big that its scale is comparable to the whole global economy. It is required by the whole global economy. The potential capabilities of this aircraft have still not been fully exhausted. But we have to share resources in order to fulfill this potential. Today, it's evident that the aircraft production industry of Russia, its current condition, would not be able to implement such a large-scale project alone. However, U.S. aircraft manufacturers are currently in about the same situation. It's an unbearable task for both countries to create a new heavy lifter of the future alone. There are no other players in this game.
And again, here comes Ruslan. Ruslan and the people who have championed it. the ones who brought it to life and who saved its life. Today, we no longer need to dispute whether it belongs to Russia or Ukraine. It is just Ruslan. The new version will require a great joint effort from all the people who have been dispersed during the time of post-Soviet turmoil. Now, Ruslan should reunite them again under its wings and draw in new people with new ideas, skills, and abilities. The new Ruslan is really needed. The Ruslan that once embodied the national idea of a great country now unites different nations into one world. Under its wings, Ruslan now belongs to the world, an aircraft that talented people wish to have the honor to work with. Young people, a new generation, many of those who now come to aviation colleges in Moscow or in Kiev say, "I want to learn to work with Ruslan."